Good morning to our American viewers, and good afternoon to those of you in Europe. My name is Joe Kane. I'm the Director of Broadband and Spectrum Policy here at ITIF. Thanks so much for joining us for our panel discussion on the future of the Internet in Europe. The impetus for this panel is the European Commission's consultation on the future of the electronic communications sector and its infrastructure. That consultation asked a number of questions, most notably whether content and application providers, sometimes called CAPs or even big tech, should pay more for ISPs' broadband infrastructure. To some, this idea is merely asking content providers to pay their fair share for the use of networks. But for others, including ITIF, we've been skeptical that the costs can or should be shifted around, as the consultation seems to suggest. While we're focusing on Europe today, this debate is part of a global trend of countries reckoning with what universal connectivity should look like and how it should be funded. So there should be lessons here that are applicable in other countries as well. We are lucky to have an expert panel today to really break down what this all means for the internet as a whole and for individual internet users. We'll have some time at the end for audience questions that you can submit using the Slido link that is on the event page and in the video description on YouTube. Now for our speakers. Their fuller bios are on our website, so I'll just give them a very brief introduction now. We have Alessandro Grappelli, who is the Deputy Director General and Director of Strategy and Communications at Etno, Scott Marcus, who is a Senior Fellow at Bruegel, and Shahan Osman, who is the Manager of TMT Strategy at Analysys Mason. So I want to start us off, thanks for joining us all, and I want to start with a sort of broad question, just for perhaps our American audience who has not been following this issue quite as closely. What is this European Commission consultation about? And what do we mean when people say, when people talk about fair share, what are we talking about? But maybe let's start with Shahan on that one.
Thanks, Joe. Happy to start. So, I think Alessandro has, lots to say about what the consultation is about in a bit. But maybe I can just start with, my understanding of it at the moment. And what I understand is it's essentially a policy that aims to facilitate payments from CAPs to ISPs on the basis of volumes of traffic that are "quote unquote" generated by these CAPs. I think for other people who might not know, there are other terms that are being used to refer to this debate. So fair share is one of the terms that's being used. Network usage fees is another term that's being used, as well as sending party network pays, which is meant to be a little bit of a callback to the calling party pays scheme that was used in telephony a while back. Now, the purpose of these payments, again, Alessandro, I'm sure you'll have more to say here, but from what I can see, are firstly to try to recover an increase in costs that are supposedly the result of traffic growth, and secondly to help achieve deployment targets regarding fiber networks and 5G in the European context. And essentially, these are what I think about as the problem that's kind of being referred to, and what I also understand is that this applies only to large CAPs that meet a certain threshold, and that there will be exemptions for public broadcasters as well as third-party commercial CDNs. And that the proposed regulatory mechanism will be essentially an obligation for CAPs to negotiate, followed by a final offer arbitration process in the event that the negotiations break down. Now, the way that we tend to think about this at Analysys Mason is, one, the extent to which the concerns raised by proponents of regulatory intervention are valid. In other words, to what extent is the problem really there? And beyond that, also to think about whether or not the solution that's being put forth, this regulatory intervention, might in fact result in unintended consequences. So I think looking forward to a productive discussion on several of these points, but perhaps I'll let Alessandro and Scott come in.
Yeah, Scott, if you want to go next, I'll let Alessandro back clean up here. And,
Great. Okay. Well, thank you. So I think that Shahan did a very good job of summarizing the discussion. But to me, I see a lot of issues here. Now, I see a lot of room for legitimate discussion between the content providers and the network operators about what costs of interconnection ought to be. I've dealt with these issues for a long time. Previously, I was a chief technology officer for a big network operator in the United States, one of the two companies that merged to form Verizon. We figured we were the fourth biggest backbone in the world at the time. And, so there's certainly scope to discuss these things. I know them both as a practitioner and also as a theorist. I published on this with some very fine economists 20 years ago. The issues have been around for a while. But with the current consultation, I think there are a number of issues that need to be raised. The first one is the consultation a consultation? To me, it reads like a commission strategy document masquerading as a consultation. A second really is how fair is fair. Fairness tends to be very much in the eyes of the beholder. Here, I think the key questions that need to be raised and that aren't clearly raised in the consultation document are, is this growth of traffic a good thing or a bad thing? Is it different from historic trends? And to what extent is growth in traffic related to growth in cost? Now, as far as the historic trends, what's been the case for as long as there's been an internet is that traffic has been growing. But by and large, the percentage growth year over year, both in the fixed network and the mobile, has tended to decline over time. The Commission, in framing the question, rightly notes that the amount of traffic generated by a small number of content firms represents an increasing share of the total. But everybody knew that that was coming for the past 10 or 12 years. This is nothing new. For my part, as someone who's studied broadband deployment for many, many years for different governmental customers, we generally view increase in traffic as a positive thing. You want to stimulate demand. It's one of the best ways to promote broadband deployment. So this growth in traffic isn't a bad thing. It's a good thing that government should be trying to encourage, not to instead to rein in with taxes. And in that sense, I really question the whole premise of this purported consultation. The positions raised by the network operators, as I say, I actually have much more sympathy with than I do with the positions put forward here by the Commission. We can come back to the costs, I think, as a later discussion.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So let's go to Alessandro now, who I think might have a slightly different take on this.
Thanks a lot for inviting, first of all, and thanks to Scott and to Shahan for their views. We worked with them as telecom operators, and so it's always a stimulating debate. First of all, on what the consultation is about, and here I will not give you the ethno view, but I will state the fact. The consultation is not about fair contribution alone. So that's a very important thing. And I think ITIF and the community that probably is listening to us is one that is positively concerned about the future of connectivity. And that's what the European Commission consultation is about. As Scott says, by reading the questionnaire, we can already understand that the Commission is concerned about how connectivity is developing in Europe and is concerned about how well can we create a solid connectivity layer to then enable the European internet and, quite frankly, the global internet. There are 4 areas tackled in the consultation, around 60 questions, so it's a long one, pretty factual. The first part is about the future of network technology. So they ask a very fitting question on what about network as a service, network virtualization? What does it mean for connectivity, for usage, and for the internet? I think that's very important. And if you want later, I'll be happy to go a bit deeper into it. Clearly, internet that works on 5G, on fiber, presents many new opportunities, also some risks. And the European Commission is trying to understand from experts, from stakeholders, from industry, from the academia, how is this technology evolution gonna go? The second part is about users, is about how are they gonna use these networks in the future? What might be the issues, also in terms of prices when it comes to usage and access to connectivity. Then there is a part that inquires about the ways in which public funding for connectivity and for stimulating the uptake of connectivity is structured to date, including questions on the Universal Service Fund. And at the end, it gets us to some questions under the so-called name fair contribution. And what they wonder, what they ask is there an imbalance today in who monetizes traffic and who builds the infrastructure for carrying that traffic? They demand very factual numbers from both us in the telecom industry and from big tech on traffic, on investment, in which parts of the network are you investing? Are you investing in the last mile, in the middle mile? Are you investing in the undersea cables, in CDNs? Are you investing in data centers? So the Commission is really getting all the facts and figures, maybe to cut a bit on the noise that we all have been doing in the past year with studies on one side and on the other of the argument. Now they are acquiring firsthand, as European Commission, the facts and figures, and that will allow them to get a first-hand view. Last thing that I would like to say, and then I'm very happy to dive a bit into the fair contribution issue, which is again a subset, not small, it's important, but it's a subset of what this consultation raises as a question. I will tell you with one line how we in the European telecom industry are seeing this debate. And I say European telecom industry because ETNO has been responding to the consultation together with the GSMA. So we are pretty representative in this moment about what European telcos think in a united way, which for those who follow the telecom sector is not always the case that we have a united position. My one-liner is that how we see the world under this future of connectivity is, number one, what our companies are doing now is taking connectivity and bringing it to the public cloud. So what we want to do and what we are doing is enabling the so-called network as a service. This brings great opportunities for European companies and for European users. And the opportunities come from the fact that with APIs, you can plug in your vertical industries and basically use a network in a whole new way as a service. The risk, and this is something that is emerging in the debate, is of course that everything that becomes a service is opened up to global competition. Competition is good, but of course there is a geopolitical and a political dimension. What Europe wants, and it's a legitimate political objective, is the same that, by the way, the US administration has for its own companies. Europe doesn't want to lose control of connectivity and wants to be able to make money on this new network as a service. Second thing that we have been saying is that right now we feel that the European markets are really fragmented compared, for example, to the US one. And right now our company are missing the strength in terms of market cap, in terms of investment capacity, to go out and compete with the big global guys on the service layer. Last thing that we are saying is that limited to the data traffic market, which is one of the markets in which we operate, today we feel that there is a regulatory asymmetry, because there are two main actors in this two-sided market, and one is telcos and the other one is big tech. And right now, one side in this data traffic market is regulated, and it's us. And we are regulated through the Open Internet Regulation, which is an extremely positive achievement of the EU. We have it, by the way, and other areas of the world don't. So right now, this is an area that is enshrined in the so-called acquis communautaire, into our established law. The other side of the equation, which is big tech, right now is not regulated. So we see a regulatory asymmetry, and our proposal for bringing a remedy to this regulatory asymmetry is to discuss about fair contribution. Over to you, Joe.
Yeah, thank you all. I think that gives a good explanation of where things are sort of headed here, what the topics for discussion are. I want to touch a little bit more on that discussion that I think, Scott, you mentioned a little bit on sort of the volume and the type of internet traffic and how that's changed over the past few decades and what we should be expecting over the next few decades. I know that there's been a lot of discussion of, is traffic sort of ballooning exponentially. We have a lot more video traffic now. If we get AR and VR traffic going across the internet, is that going to be a whole lot more? And does that sort of fundamentally change the economics of a broadband infrastructure deployment, such that we should be looking for new funding mechanisms or changing the sort of regulatory structure of that? Scott, you can pick up on that, or anyone else. I know it's been.
Well, I'm happy to take it. Again, traffic is growing. This is nothing new. Traffic has always been growing. Actually, a study commissioned by Etno, I believe, from Arthur D. Little was talking about traffic growth in the range of 20-25% per year, which is really, which I don't take issue with. I think that's entirely plausible, but it's also very much in line with historical data. I'd actually sent a little around before we had this call. And, if anything, the percentage rates were higher in the historic past, so it's not a shock. Now, the tilt, indeed, is running toward a small number of content providers. People talking about YouTube and, of course, Netflix, and that's real. Again, a question whether this is a good thing or a bad thing is something you can debate. In a two-sided market, promoting usage is generally a good thing. The question then, though, is what does that imply for costs? And I looked at this pretty hard about 10 years ago when we were having a debate that has many echoes of the same one we have today. And it actually looked at the time like for the fixed network, the decline in unit costs was running at almost exactly the same rate as the growth in traffic, which meant that if you multiplied the numbers out, the total costs were actually surprisingly stable, which meant that the reason why the network operators couldn't raise prices was because their costs or the costs of their competitors were also pretty flat. So, so that to me is really one of the key determinants. Now, on this AR/VR question, the Commission seems to have latched onto this. The people that are actually doing this aren't so convinced that there's an increase in traffic, or at least that there's an increase in traffic that will matter. In reality, most of the augmented reality services are probably things you'll be using at home on the fixed network. And the fixed network has very little traffic sensitivity once the network has been upgraded to fiber. I mean, at that point, the traffic sensitive costs are going to be really pretty darn flat up to very, very high levels. So in that sense, it's really rather unlikely. I was actually meeting with some senior people at Meta just 2 days ago, and they're of the view that there's actually hardly any impact on cost as a result of AR, VR, or metaverse. So again, I have a sense that the Commission here is kind of on the wrong horse. Anyway, over to the others.
Yeah, Alessandro?
Maybe first of all, I want to agree with Scott that traffic is a good thing, and that's why we all discuss also the importance of demand stimulation, especially in markets where there is a lack of skills, for example, for using a certain type of services. I come from Italy, where that is a big barrier, but I do not think that the issue at stake here is just the data growth per se. Data should not and is not seen as a negative thing by telcos, by definition, even though I can understand how the fair share debate, how it is being debated, especially in Brussels, might give a different view. The point is who invested in making all that traffic bearable for the network, and whether that entity that invests in network capacity is the same that then is able or not to monetize the traffic. That's the first thing that I would like to say. And of course, if the one that invests is not the same that monetizes, the market might suffer some problems or some imbalances. The other aspect is, what did we invest in as telcos? Are we able to put our capex on things beyond the creating capacity for the traffic generated by big tech? Are we able to put it in rollout, therefore in coverage, which from a policy viewpoint is probably the thing that you care. You care that about the fact that you have a network with good capacity, but you also care that that gets everywhere to all your citizens. That's one. And the other one is, what about the service layer? Europe wants to start leading also in the service layer, and the 5G deployment offers an opportunity for Europe to take back some leadership after we lost the one on the consumer internet. So now Europe has these companies, telecom operators, that are throwing a lot of capex, a lot of investment into building 5G, but it doesn't want to lose out again on the service layer that comes on top. So clearly, if a telecom operator is busy investing only in capacity that is then used by and monetized by others, then it doesn't have the margins to invest in the rest. Very last thing, I think Scott is right in saying that factoring in VR is very difficult today. And that's something that we have seen when we work with AD Little, with this study that we published recently together with them and Ethno and the GSMA. I would like to correct a bit the idea that everything will go through Wi-Fi. It will. I agree, a lot of it goes, but when we ask to our CTOs, we see that there are a lot of use cases right now are running on 5G because of security reasons, for example. So most of the trials that we see around Europe in this field are enabled by 5G because it offers a superior security. And last thing, what about AI generated content? Now, I have a joke, but today being the CTO of a telco is like being a meteorologist in the period of climate change. Basically, you are a fortune teller, because how do you factor in AI generated content? We don't know. Maybe we should ask ChatGPT.
Perhaps so. Shahan, would you anything to add on this?
Not particularly on the AI content, but I think there are a few additions I can make regarding traffic, as well as thinking about broadband deployment alongside traffic. I'm really glad to hear that everyone is on the same page with regard to the fact that traffic is a good thing and needs to be promoted first and foremost. I think it's also useful to take a little bit of a step back and ask, why are we thinking about traffic as the measure that's being talked about, if indeed we are worried about networks being constrained. So, typically traffic is being referred to because traffic is easy to measure, but in reality, it's not actually traffic that's constraining networks, but, it's rather the sort of peak bandwidth requirements, both for individuals and when, individuals use networks at the same time or not, what we tend to call peak concurrent bandwidth, right? That determines the extent to which networks are being used or not. And what's interesting, actually, thinking about traffic growth of 20 to 25% per year, which we are, we can validate that as well, is that when you think about the actual metric that's driving network utilization, which is peak concurrent demand, we see this as actually having lower growth. So, for example, in the UK, BT does publish some information about how their peak concurrent demand evolves over time, and between 2021 and 2022, it's only a 10% growth. So while underlying traffic may grow at higher rates, the metric that is actually constraining networks is growing at lower rates. And just noting regarding the UK, compared to in general in the UK, if you sort of think about what we call this peak of peaks figure averaged over users, and on a per user basis, we find this to be something at around 3 Mbps per customer. And in fact, Ofcom reports that the average peak speed of fixed broadband connections in the UK is something like 50 Mbps, right? So from that perspective, fixed networks are nowhere near constrained. And just for reference, the UK does have less fiber coverage than sort of major EU economies, with the exception of Germany. So you can imagine that those figures are actually, in fact, higher in other European countries. So that's one thing to think about, and the other thing to think about as well is sometimes we use this phrase "correlation is not causation," and I think that's a great phrase to talk about the relationship between traffic growth and broadband infrastructure deployment. So essentially, even though traffic is growing and better broadband networks and fiber networks are being deployed, it is not the case that one is causing the other. In fact, fixed networks, which account for the majority of traffic, the reason why a lot of networks are moving towards fiber is because copper is coming to the end of its lifespan, right? Fiber has lots of properties that are superior to copper, and operators move towards it because it's more performant, it's more energy efficient, it's more cost effective, right? And that, along with competition, has driven fiber deployment in lots of different countries. And yes, although that does increase capacities of networks over time once it's being deployed, it's not the case again that traffic is driving that. I think Scott also mentioned a few points in terms of once fiber networks are deployed, capacities, incremental capacity growth is relatively inexpensive. And just a couple more points here. Lots of the costs that are going to fiber networks at the moment are deployment, right? So establishing the fiber connection to the end premises. A lot of this is passive infrastructure that once it is sort of deployed, it's going to be there and it's going to be usable for decades, right? The only thing that does need to be upgraded over time are sort of active network components. And it's an interesting thing about these active network components, actually, because these items need to be refreshed every few years because they have shorter lifespans than passive infrastructure equipment. And what tends to happen when this equipment is refreshed is that at the same price levels that operators would have put in this equipment in the first place, for subsequent generations, for the same price levels as previous generations, the capacities of equipment increases substantially over time and becomes a lot more effective. So essentially, what happens in fiber networks is just by virtue of the fact that you have to continue maintaining your network and refreshing this equipment, your networks are already increasing in capacity. So, this is all going into, once again, the idea that networks are nowhere near constrained in terms of capacities or in terms of traffic. Now, I think Alessandro also mentioned a few interesting points on, talking about investment and deployment and so on and so forth. And yes, completely agree. There is work to do in terms of improving connectivity in Europe. And I think our interest is really in ensuring that you really focus into where those gaps are. One thing I can comment on from our work with lots of investors in this market is that there's no shortage of appetite for investment in digital infrastructure. Lots of money is going from private equity funds, from pension funds, from specialized infrastructure vehicles into things like new fiber networks as well as towercos, right? So again, this is an area where you're talking about who invests. It's probably good not to ignore the effect that external investors have on this ecosystem as well.
Yeah, thank you. There's a lot there. I think I want to sort of pick up on a couple things that were said there and maybe work that into another question. Alessandro, I think you sort of framed the sort of ISP side of this really well as sort of we're the ones doing the investment and then everyone else is using our capacity and monetizing it, and we're not to the same extent. And I wonder, there's been some talk of, well, what about the ways in which caps are investing, things like CDNs, how does that help lower the peaks or constraints on capacity? And then on the other side is like, well, what about ISPs trying to capture some of that monetization by negotiating a contract, having paid peer agreements or transit agreements or something like that? How much is that a possibility in this space?
Thank you, Joe. I think you raised two very good points. The point of commercial negotiations, of the existing commercial negotiations, which, by the way, show that commercial negotiations can happen in compatibility with the EU open internet rules, because, again, in Europe, we do have a law on that, and we are operating in this context and within the boundaries of this law. The main reason why you see today a united front of telcos saying that things are not fair, it's because there is a great deal of frustration of how these negotiations happen between European telcos and big tech, or maybe they don't even take place. I know that I will be told that right now you don't see enough court cases to show that there is a market failure. But I'm speaking here with distinguished economists, and the absence of something is not necessarily a proof of a lack of a problem. And what I can tell you also from my observation point, Ethno, which is the association that normally represents the biggest player in the market, is that we got a lot of interest from the small players because their reasoning for supporting the fair contribution is that if the big guys, and I'm referring to the Deutsche Telekoms and the Telefonicas and the Vodafones, do not feel that commercial negotiations today bring to a satisfactory result, in many cases that they don't even manage to sit down as small operators. And frankly, it is pretty intuitive to understand that when you have maybe a local telecom operator in a European market, say Denmark, 6 million people, Belgium, 11 million people, can you imagine that operator negotiating terms and conditions with global companies that have, in some cases, almost trillion euros market capitalizations? So there is a main issue of fairness, or at least that is our point, and we feel and we believe that the facts and figures that our companies provided to the European Commission through the consultation will help show that. Because until now, everybody has been speaking in absence of evidence. And this includes very distinguished places, including BEREC. What the Commission is doing is asking the tough questions, asking people to give them also the type of confidential information that a trade association, for example, by definition cannot gather, and then they will judge for themselves. And we will see if and what the Commission will find out. So I think that the fairness and commercial negotiations aspect is an important one. For the rest, I think your other question was on the monetization and on the revenues. And there I go back from where I stand to the regulatory asymmetry. There are certain things that, because of regulation, we cannot do with data traffic. And this is justified, quite frankly, by higher interests, which are interests like the ability of every user to access all of the available information at any time. And these are principles that go beyond industry problems. So all that we are asking is to look at the other player in the market and whether that regulatory asymmetry that right now limits what we can do in terms of revenue making shouldn't be addressed. And I saw that, by the way, this has been addressed in terms of how the market functions well or not, also by Toulouse School of Economics, that published a working paper last year in October, and then they left it open for academic comment for a few months, and now in March they published the result of the corrected paper after the academic debate. And my understanding from that Toulouse School of Economic work is that they believe that if you craft a fair contribution regulation right, and then we can discuss what that means, you can increase consumer welfare, and you can also positively affect user prices, which, by the way, was recognized also in another study by Oxera that has been known for being against fair share, but digging or reading all the 100 pages, you see that there are some positive benefits to correcting the market problems right now and the regulatory asymmetries that determine them.
Yeah, Scott?
Okay, so if I could jump in here. So actually, this is an area where Alessandro and I think, would find quite a bit of agreement. Now, when we talk about regulatory asymmetries between the caps and the network operators, one, of course, has to bear in mind, too, the caps are getting hit with a huge amount of new regulation concurrently. Digital Markets Act, Digital Services Act, Artificial Intelligence Data Act, but they don't actually deal with this particular issue. A point that's been raised by the network operators that I give some serious weight to is that the open internet regulation, which, by the way, doesn't explicitly deal with network interconnection, but that it may have tilted the negotiating game in a way that hasn't been fully appreciated in European law or practice. Normally, the negotiations between network operators and caps, I mean, what almost everybody has been saying for the last 20 years is, best left to pure negotiation between the commercial parties, don't mess with it. One of the concerns is the one that Alessandro clearly stated, which is at this point, just because of the change in size, the relative size of the largest online platforms, maybe that game can't be guaranteed to be as fair as it once was, if it was. But also that with the open internet regulation, the network neutrality rules in Europe, that the network operators lost an ability they once would have had. Implicitly, there was always a bit of a trade-off between parties to a peering negotiation. If the peering negotiation gradually declines in quality, whose customers are hurt more? And effectively, today, anything that hurts the customer's ability to access services at full quality would tend to result in penalties to the network operators. It means that they don't have the ability to bargain on this basis. Alessandro's member, Deutsche Telekom, has been, I think, very clear in stating this argument, and it's an argument that I give some weight to. So, and also I would say, the fact that we don't have a lot of documented evidence of problems with the negotiating arrangement doesn't guarantee that there's none. But on the flip side, also, I'd say many people who tried to look at this, including the Axera study that was just referenced, and also work by Barrick, they say they don't see any evidence of a problem. So I don't think that it's either proven that there's a problem, but I wouldn't say it's exhaustively proven that there isn't either. And I think it's something that could be seriously looked at. Now, on the paper that Alessandro mentioned, it's a paper by Bruno Julien, very well-respected economist and co-author Brevard. I think the most important consequence there is really a refinement on what would happen if there were charges. And the observation is that some content providers, some caps, would pass those on in charges to their customers, particularly, say, caps like Netflix would probably do that. Advertising-based caps, probably not. It would manifest in a different way. Again, I wasn't entirely convinced by other parts of the paper, but that I think was a really important refinement. The work I did years ago with Lafont, Tirole, and Ray, basically was talking about exactly what would happen if there were such charges. In the absence of this kind of effects, you would indeed expect that the charges over interconnection would directly flow into costs to consumers and into basically which side of the market gets more benefit out of the arrangements. Anyway, as I said, I think there are things here that could be legitimately discussed. Whether the consultation will get us there, I'm not so convinced, but I think there's some legitimate issues here.
Can I pick up, Joe, on this point of the prices? Because I think I agree with Scott, it's particularly important. And when I was saying before that the Toulouse School paper says that under certain conditions you can increase consumer welfare, I was referring precisely to what Scott was saying. It's how do you define the scope? By the way, that is not entirely the industry's position, but I think it's a very relevant point. One of the things that we hear a lot in the messy debate here in town, it's Brussels is like Washington, there is a lot of noise and smoke, is consumers will pay more. Well, it depends on which caps are in scope, because some cannot pass on these unless they will take even more of our personal data and monetize it otherwise, but they will not be able to pass it. And also one other consideration that for me is very important, that is also in the Tirole paper, is about the internet prices or the internet bills. And there, the Tirole paper, the Julien paper even sees a positive effect on prices. Again, not an industry position, but it's interesting to see academics seeing that maybe with fair contribution, you stop a bit the cross-subsidization between the internet bills and the business model of big tech, and prices might go down. And for me, from a policy viewpoint, this is very relevant, because not everybody has a streaming bill, but everybody has an internet bill. So again, if I try to take a general interest viewpoint, maybe this price discussion should take a bit more importance in the reflections. It has been buried by now, and I can understand why, but I think it's definitely one that should be had. By the way, when I go to panels, very often I find myself with speakers from big tech who say, why do you want our money? Just raise consumer prices. Well, one, I don't think this would be very politically acceptable. And two, the point is also, would that be just fair? That to get the traffic that is sent or is monetized by a group of companies, you cross-subsidize with all the internet users that maybe are not using the latest VR machine or the latest AI tool.
Yeah, Shahan, anything to add on this?
Yeah, maybe just a couple of points. I think on the, Alessandro, you make a good point on, it depends on the caps that are in scope of the regulation. Scott, did you want to?
I didn't want to interrupt you. I wanted to come in.
Okay, no worries. You talk about, companies that are in scope, but I think the reality is a lot of smaller caps at the moment do depend on larger caps for cloud services, for example, if they're cloud customers. So even if you do target only larger caps, there's nothing that's stopping them from passing this over to smaller caps in the form of higher cloud pricing. That's one thing to think about. Another thing is also there was a blog post recently, I think in the past month, that was quite interesting by Cloudflare, which is a content delivery network that, as far as I understand, would not fall within the scope of regulation based on what I've seen so far. But I think Cloudflare is has a slightly different view in terms of when talking about bargaining power, really, who has it and might use it in a way that could cause pricing to be higher. I think some of the things they talk about are the fact that there is quite a competitive market for IP transit in Europe, and that has resulted in low wholesale prices that small ISPs, for example, benefit from, and essentially raising the concern that if even through a regulatory mechanism of negotiation followed by arbitration, essentially what you're doing is regulation setting an interconnection price between large caps and large telcos, which essentially could then become the interconnection price for the rest of the market. And there are some also net neutrality considerations around this, in the sense where if large caps do pay, right, will smaller networks then be relegated, and essentially have their traffic being treated as second class? And there are some examples there of larger telcos, behaving in ways which suggest that could happen. So again, just something else to add to the discussion to think about.
Yes,
I just wanted to jump in. Alessandro and I actually seem to be largely on the same page here, but this notion that a change in the payment structure would result in lower prices implies that the money actually gets to the network operators. And what I think the network operators had been arguing for was some changes in the negotiating arrangements that would help equalize or change the negotiating powers in the negotiation. The commission consultation seems to be going in a different direction, looking at imposing some kind of tax. The Axera study that Alessandro mentioned earlier makes the same argument based on transaction cost reasoning. And so I think the natural question is, if something were implemented that way, does the money actually get back to the network operators in a way that could translate into costs, or does it merely turn into a slush fund for the commission? Now, we actually have something that's heading in the same direction that often gets ignored in this debate, and that's the change to corporate taxation that's been mutually agreed by a very large number of countries as part of the OECD G20 BEPS reform that would result in something like 150 billion per year in additional tax revenues and 120 billion a year in changes in taxing rights. And most of that money comes from the same companies, because it's essentially trying to deal with companies, a large fraction of whose value is in intangible assets that in recent years have mostly been parked in low tax or no tax jurisdictions. So again, where's that money going to go? Is it going to go toward building networks? probably mostly not. If you look at funding that recently happened in Europe for the RRF, the Recovery Fund, only a couple of countries used that on a large scale for building out broadband. Most of them used it for e-government services and for other things. So again, the question whether this really makes it back to the network operators is a very open question. Frankly, if I were Alessandro, I would be a little annoyed at the Commission having sort of hijacked the regulatory initiative from the network operators.
Maybe.
Yeah, Alessandro, we'll go to Alessandro on that, and then also just if you have other comments on just like what would the structure of these payments look like, and how should it work? Yeah.
Let me comment a bit on this. First of all, I agree with Scott on the tax issues. So and also on the public versus private investment. And by the way, the number that the European Commission itself is using as a reference for a few years now in the context of the digital decade targets that say full 5G and full fiber by the end of the decade is that around 90% of the investment needs to come from private and 10% will be funding. That proportion might change a little bit because of the recovery fund that was just mentioned by Scott, but how we see that money being spent right now is mostly either in really remote areas or on demand side or digital transformation of the public administration. Our argument for supporting a direct contribution, so for ensuring that that money flows to those who invest in the network, that are the telecom companies, is double-folded. If you do a direct contribution, first of all, you are increasing the pie of the 90%. So you are, in principle, more transformational than if you act on the residual part that is the public fund. And that's one argument. The second argument that we have is that if what we are discussing about here is looking a bit at the asymmetries, correcting a bit a market that maybe doesn't allocate a value in the best way at the moment, then taking it from the natural commercial negotiations that exist inside the market is probably more respectful of the market than a heavy-handed regulatory intervention that then might end up in the public fund. The second thing that I wanted to say, and it was to Shahan, I do understand the worries raised by Cloudflare, but there is at least one that does not make sense, because you cannot prioritize traffic in Europe, because in Europe we have net neutrality regulation in the acquis communautaire. So that would be illegal. I mean, you can try, but you will end up in court by all means. So I don't think that that would be possible. Maybe in other jurisdictions, but other jurisdictions are not discussing this. Very last thing is often our proposal is misunderstood as a sender's party pay proposal, and people think of the South Korean model. Well, first of all, South Korea I always thought of South Korea as a cool place for tech geeks because they got excellent connectivity. They got some of the coolest technology companies, and probably some of you are using a Korean built device right now. And now in Brussels, they are describing South Korea as the nightmare of anybody who believes in the digital economy. It's a bit laughable, frankly, because South Korea is a place that we all look up to. But we're not proposing a sender's party pay, because sender's party pay is a general principle that applies to everybody, to the big and to the small. That's why in Europe there is this discussion on the threshold and therefore on the scope. These were questions raised in the public consultation. And going back to our dear economists at the Toulouse School of Economics, the scope and who is captured is especially important to determine whether this is going to be a good or a bad thing for the ecosystem. And on this we agree, and that's why we put forward some views on how, in our view, you can carefully define a scope that does not disrupt innovation and that for sure does not go and harm the small and medium guys.
Yeah, so I want to a lot of good points made there. I want to circle back a little bit too. There's been mentioned a couple times the open internet regulation and net neutrality, and that's sort of the cause of some of the negotiating asymmetries. And I wonder, why isn't that sort of the place to look? Say, let's sort of allow for more negotiation on the ISP side, allow them to have the negotiating power that the net neutrality regulations took away from them, rather than, it sort of seems like the fair contribution debate would say, let's just build more regulations on top of the previous regulations to fix the problem of those, and then later we'll figure out what unintended consequences we had with the next set of regulations, and then we'll have to do it all over again. Are we sort of ending up in a cycle of that when you could just say, hey, let's just say you're allowed to negotiate and each side has equal negotiating power from the beginning? Yeah, Scott.
Well, as someone who's published an awful lot about net neutrality over the years, I actually think the net neutrality regulation went a bit too far. When I was doing work for the on net neutrality for the Parliament in 2014, I argued that they should really try to target the regulation a bit more narrowly and not restrict practices that could potentially be welfare enhancing. I think this notion that prioritization based on commercial considerations should be flatly prohibited really went too far. The court decisions that have come up since in areas like zero rating are a fair realization of what's already in the Act, but I think the Act is a bit too restrictive. I don't think that would solve this problem. It would solve one aspect of the problem if there were a more liberal revision to net neutrality. Whether this is a politically realistic objective, though, I sort of doubt. I don't think the politics in Europe are ready today to make a change there. Mm-hmm. Alessandro, I'd be interested in your thoughts.
I think Scott is correct in his analysis on the political feasibility. By the way, I state it again, we said it on day one when we first published the Axon report on this topic. We are not seeking for a review of the net neutrality principles. Other jurisdictions, for example, the UK, are reviewing and tweaking, are looking at reviewing and tweaking the net neutrality regulation, because there has been Brexit, and so now they get to choose what to keep. And some tech players, again, when I was speaking with them on panels, suggested that should be instead the preferred solution. Now, every investor and every company wants regulatory certainty. We got the EU Open Internet Regulation in 2015. I think that looking at the response of stakeholders, and I mean telcos, NGOs, and so on, there is no appetite right now to reopen the EU Open Internet rules. Scott worked for the Parliament, so he is aware of the complexity. So there is a stable set of rules. That is why, to Joe's point, we now propose to address the regulatory asymmetry based on what the current legal situation is in the European Union. And what we are proposing, by the way, is very close to how you were summarizing it, Joe. We are asking for a general principles that say that we have the right to negotiate, and they need to sit down with us in this negotiation. And only if these negotiations car crash, then should a third neutral party arbitrator intervene. We are companies. Our members are companies. They want a solution that is, one, as close as possible to how the internet works and keeps how the internet works today. And two, they want something that is as close as possible to commercial negotiations, because that's what a company in a free market, yet regulated, wants and wishes.
Yeah, Shahan, anything else on that?
I guess maybe just pointing out the fact that I think currently companies do and can enter into negotiated paid arrangements. I think Deutsche Telekom doesn't appear, and essentially only accepts transit. It also does, notably, I think Deutsche Telekom also doesn't allow for CDN servers to be stashed within its network, which lots of other networks around the world have done in order to increase the efficiency of traffic delivery. So Deutsche Telekom is one example of that. In France, there's also use of pay peering. So it's not the case that negotiation doesn't happen today, and in some of these instances, the payments are actually already there. And I think maybe just touching on an earlier point on South Korea that Alessandro brought up, I think taking a step back without going, I get your point that you're not advocating the same model as what's in South Korea, but there are a couple of interesting lessons, I think, and observations that can come out of it. One is the idea that sometimes regulatory intervention might breed more regulatory intervention, in the sense that in South Korea, unintended consequences happen, and then subsequent decisions had to be made to try to account or make up for the problems that were caused. That's one issue, and maybe Scott might have more to say on that. And the second thing, which is interesting, is I know Alessandro talked about looking up to South Korea as a place which has great connectivity, and I think we'll all certainly agree. And I'm not saying that you're making this argument, Alessandro, but elsewhere we have seen, for instance, this fact that South Korea does well on connectivity to promote the idea that what they're doing on interconnection is a good role model, when in fact they had NGA coverage of 95% in 2012 before any of this was even being discussed in the South Korean context.
Yeah, Scott, and then any final thoughts you have? We're running close on time, so yeah, we'll go around one more time to everybody.
Okay, thanks. Well, the point I want to come back to Alessandro on this question of mediation or arbitration. It's not a bad idea. Again, Deutsche Telekom has been particularly forthright in proposing this. The biggest concern, though, is trying to have mediation or arbitration if you don't have a standard to negotiate to. I have a hard time seeing how it can work. Arbitration without a standard is likely to just result in a cutting the baby, slicing the baby in half kind of solution. There's really no agreement, I would say, among the academics as to what constitutes fairness here today. And I think that's a fair discussion we can have, but we don't have the answer today. And I worry that arbitration in that context isn't going to do anything useful. Now, on this topic of the open internet regulation, we should talk a little about what interconnection is. There actually are provisions in the European Code. I'm thinking especially of Articles 59 and 60. That effectively would require negotiation, would require dealing in good faith on interconnection. Interestingly, the connection between a CAP and a network operator, almost any engineer in the business would say this is interconnection. The law doesn't say it's interconnection. The law says that interconnection is a connection between two companies that provide network services to the public. So if the CAP isn't providing network connectivity as a service to the public, what it's doing isn't interconnection, therefore it falls outside the scope of those guarantees. So, so maybe there would be a solution in that direction that doesn't require a revision to the open internet regulation as such, because the open internet regulation basically doesn't say a word about interconnection. There's one word that has nothing to do with what we're talking about today. It actually doesn't restrict anything here. It does have an impact on the negotiating position along the lines that Alessandro said. So there might be legal solutions. A lot of what's really needed here, however, I think is some hard thinking about really what the right model here is, or if there is any change needed to this notion of simple commercial negotiations, which for reasons that I think Alessandro and I seem to agree with, it's not as convincing an argument as it would have been 10 years ago that it always yields the right results. Thanks.
Thank you. Alessandro, any final thoughts?
Well, first of all, thank you to ITIF and to the speakers, because it's one of the rare speaking slots I did on this topic in which we could actually discuss the substance and get somewhere, I feel. So thanks a lot to the fellow colleagues. My final point maybe is, and picking up from the interconnection aspect, I think intuition of Scott is very interesting, and it also brings me to reflect to how the issue moves beyond the interconnection. I saw a study coming into this meeting that just came out that calculated for the US that for every €1 earned by a streamer, 0.48 cents are unrecovered costs in the middle mile for the network operator. So we need to have a reflection that goes beyond the interconnection, and that's where the regulatory trouble might come, and the reflection. That's why this matter will be difficult to discuss. But I think it's very good that we are discussing, and it's very important that we are discussing it, because ultimately what we are discussing is how to invest in the future of the internet, or in the internet of the future, because there is no internet without telecom building networks. And so we are part of this ecosystem, and we should be taking care of each other and thinking that everything is in balance so that the ecosystem can grow.
Shahan, any final thoughts?
Sure, I'll just wrap this up quickly. Again, thank you for the invitation, and thank you for fellow panelists for the good discussion. I think maybe just bringing it back to this fair share proposal and the idea of traffic needing to be taxed, or some form of negotiation that results in any situation where traffic is used as the basis of payments. I would agree with Alessandra that there are issues in networks, and we all want to move towards better networks moving forward, more applications and better services for everyone. But effectively putting a tax on traffic, regardless of the mechanism, is not the way that we envision going about it.
Yeah, thank you all. Thank you to the audience for joining us, and thanks to our panelists for giving us a lot to think about. And I hope we can keep the discussion going after today as the issue develops. Now, thanks, everyone.